Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion, Breaking the Cost Cycle, Taking Control of Your Healthcare Cost Strategy. Before we get started, here are a few quick notes to help you stay connected and informed. Following the webinar, we'll send a link of the recording to all registrants so you can revisit the conversation or share it with your team. At the end of the discussion, a short survey will appear. It only takes a moment to fill out, and your feedback helps us shape future conversations that deliver the guidance and clarity you expect from Hub. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Anthony Scott, Employee Benefits Chief Consulting Officer at Hub International.
Thank you, Maria. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Breaking the Cost Cycle, Taking Control of Your Healthcare Cost Strategy. I'm Anthony Scott, Chief Consulting Officer for Employee Benefits at Hub International, and I'm glad you're joining us for what I think is one of the most important and practical conversations we can have right now about employer-sponsored healthcare. A quick word about Hub. We're a leading global insurance brokerage and financial services firm, ranked among the top brokers in the world. What sets our employee benefits practice apart is how we bring clinical, pharmacy, analytics, financial, and compliance expertise together, all working in concert on behalf of our clients. This webinar is anchored in Hub's newly released 2026 Cost Management Report, Breaking the Cost Cycle, How Integrated Benefit Strategies Can Help Control Rising Plan Costs, which examines the most significant cost pressures facing employer health plans today and offers a clear, data-driven path forward. Our goal isn't to tell you what you already know. You know costs are rising. Our goal is to show you what to do about it in a way that's integrated, strategic, and built to deliver compounding results over time. By the end of today's session, you'll have a clear framework for tackling your most pressing cost challenges, whether that's specialty drug spend, GLP-1 coverage decisions, or the growing reality of gene therapy claims, and a practical roadmap for where to start. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to acknowledge that many of you submitted questions with your registration. We'll do our very best to address as many of those as time allows. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm joined today by three of my Hub colleagues. First off is Nelly Rose. She is Hub's National Pharmacy Practice Leader. Nelly works with employers across the country to evaluate PBM arrangements, optimize pharmacy contracts, and build specialty drug strategies that deliver real, measurable savings. Next up is Ashley Mayberry, who's our National Director of Clinical Consulting. Ashley leads clinical strategy for employer health plans, from high-cost claimant management to site of care optimization to GLP-1 program design. Her work sits at the intersection of clinical reality and financial accountability. And last but not least, Raquel McClellan. She's Hub's National Director of Clinical Informatics. Raquel leads the data and clinically informed analytics function, identifying risk early, generating population-level insights, and turning claims data into targeted action. Together, the three of them represent the pharmacy, clinical, and analytics expertise that is the engine behind Hub's integrated approach to cost control. So here's what we'll cover today. We'll start by setting the context, why the old approach isn't working, and what a better approach looks like. From there, we'll move through three pillars of immediate cost control. First off is optimizing high-cost therapeutics. Next is managing GLP-1 coverage strategically. And then last but not least, and getting ahead of gene therapy risk. We'll then bring those pillars together to show why an integrated approach delivers results that individual strategies simply can't. And we'll close with a practical path forward, including a 12-month roadmap you can take back to your teams. We'll do our best to leave time for Q&A at the end and address the questions that came in with your registration. So now let's dive in. Let's start with the problem we're all here to solve. Managing rising healthcare costs. If you've been managing employer health plans for any length of time, this next slide is going to feel very familiar to you, and maybe even a little bit frustrating. You've raised deductibles, you've renegotiated contracts, you may have even moved to self-insurance. However, costs keep climbing anyway. The numbers tell the story. Medical trend is at an all-time high of 9%, which is a 15-year record. Specialty drugs represent just 2% of all prescriptions, but consume half of all pharmacy spending. The average family premium has reached nearly $27,000, which is up 26% in 5 years. And a single gene therapy claim can exceed $4.25 million. These aren't projections, they're the environment that we're operating in right now. So the question we want to answer today is, what can employers do about it? For most employers, healthcare cost management has followed a predictable and exhausting cycle, which is costs rise, benefits get cut, the burden shifts to employees, their satisfaction drops, and then the cycle starts all over again. The employers who are breaking that cycle are doing something fundamentally different. Instead of reacting to costs after they hit, they're getting ahead of them. They're using data to understand their population. They're identifying risk early before conditions become catastrophic claims. They're deploying targeted strategies and measuring what works. That's the shift we're here to help you make today. Now, here's how that looks in practice across all three pillars. For high-cost therapeutics, it's about specialty drug analytics, PBM contract optimization, site of care redirection, and biosimilar adoption. For GLP-1 management, it's about covering the right conditions and building structured programs with medical oversight for weight management. For gene therapy, it's about risk identification, stop loss, and captive solutions, followed by outcomes-based coverage models. Each of these tools is powerful on its own. When they work together, built on a foundation of data and clinical insight, the impact compounds. Let's go deeper on each one. Nelly, I'd like to hand it to you to start with Pillar 1.
Thank you, Anthony. Let's talk about specialty drugs, because this is where the biggest cost opportunity in most employer health plans actually lives. I want to orient you to how we think about high-cost drug spend, because the strategy looks different depending on where the drug is paid for. Drugs dispensed through the pharmacy benefit are managed through strategies such as formulary design, prior authorization, therapeutic substitution, and rebate optimization. Those are the levers we control before prescription is filled. Drugs billed through the medical benefit require a different playbook. Ashley, can you walk us through the medical side?
Sure, thank you, Nelly. The medical benefit side is where we often see the biggest surprises for most employers, mainly because it operates almost entirely outside the traditional pharmacy guardrails. When a high-cost drug is billed through the medical benefit, the employer usually has less availability, fewer preset controls, and frankly, less coverage at the point of care. That's why the strategy has to look very different. It's less about formulary and more about clinical oversight, that site of care optimization, and just making sure that the right authorization criteria are actively in place.
Okay, so let's talk numbers. Because until you see the data, it can be hard to appreciate why specialty drugs deserve this much attention. 2%. That is the share of all prescriptions that are classified as specialty drugs. Those 2% account for 50% of pharmacy spend and growing. So when factoring in drugs being administered in a clinical setting and billed through the medical benefit, specialty can represent up to 10% of total healthcare spend for a self-funded employer. It's no surprise that inflammatory conditions, oncology, and rare diseases continue to dominate specialty spend. But our number one cost driver is also our biggest opportunity right now. The biosimilar pipeline in the inflammatory space is the most mature it's ever been. And plans that move on it now are going to see a very different cost story at renewal. Let's talk about what that opportunity looks like and the specific moves that can help your plan capture it. So I'd like to spend a moment here because biosimilars represent the most under-captured opportunity in employer pharmacy benefits right now. We have 90 FDA-approved biosimilars in the market today, and we're at the beginning of an enormous patent cliff. 118 biologics are losing patent protection between now and 2034. with an average cost reduction of 30%, projecting across the entire pipeline represents about $181 billion in healthcare savings opportunity. But how do you actually capture this? So here are some strategies I'd like to share with you. First, evaluate for biosimilar first formulary. Tier the biosimilars as the preferred product. And if a member prescriber still wants a brand reference drug, require a prior authorization. You're making the biosimilar the path of least resistance because it should be. Secondly, audit your PBM. This one keeps me up at night. Rebates can actually incentivize your PBM to keep the branded product preferred, even when the biosimilar costs your plan less in the net. That's a direct conflict of interest. Your formulary should be built around your net plan cost, not the PBM's rebate revenue. Third, enable auto substitution. For biosimilars, the FDA has designated as interchangeable. The pharmacist can swap at the counter without delay. Make sure that your plan documents in your PBM have this turned on, as that does not happen automatically. And fourth, educate and convert. Prescriber hesitation is real. Physicians default to the branded product, whether it's out of habit, out of familiarity, sometimes out of their manufacturer relationship. Clinical outreach changes the pattern. When prescribers are engaged directly with outcomes data, conversion accelerates. And don't forget the member side. Employees who understand that biosimilars are FDA approved, clinically equivalent, and cheaper for them personally, they make better decisions. Before you can pull any of these levers, you need to know whether there's an opportunity within your claims data. How many members are on high-cost biologics today? Which ones have the interchangeable biosimilar available? And what your plan is actually paying net of rebates. That's where the analytics starts, and that's where the business case gets built. So I'm going to hand this over to Raquel, who's going to take us deeper into the clinical informatics behind that analysis.
Thank you, Nelly. I want to pick up on the cost side of this conversation and talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. Where a drug is administered can matter as much as which drug it is. And on this slide, you can see a very straightforward example. An infusion therapy was administered at a hospital outpatient department, and it costs about $8,500. That same drug delivered at a physician's office costs about $3,800. It's the same drug, the same clinical outcome, 55% less. That's not a niche finding. It's a consistent pattern we're seeing across infusion therapies nationwide. Now, the challenge is that the providers are frequently referring patients to higher cost settings by default. This is, as Nelly alluded to, just kind of status quo. Clinical informatics is what changes that dynamic. By examining claims data through a clinical lens, we can identify members receiving infusion care in unnecessarily expensive settings and evaluate the opportunity to redirect them. Where the intervention in the moment is not feasible, these insights form the next plan design adjustments and strategies to align quality care in a setting more aligned with an employer's fiduciary management of cost. Ashley, can you share some examples of those strategies you deal in daily?
Sure. Thank you, Raquel. So really, there's several strategies that we can talk about. The first is your site of care optimization, making sure that those high-cost infusible drugs are being administered in the most clinically appropriate and cost-effective setting. Hospital outpatient is almost always the most expensive site, and in a lot of cases, a physician's doctor's office or home fusion setting is equally safe and at a fraction of the cost. That shift alone can generate significant savings without changing the drug at all. The second I want to talk about is your prior auth and the clinical criteria alignment. Ensuring that authorization requirements for medical benefit drugs are actually enforced, and that the criteria are evidence-based and there is a mechanism to flagging when those drugs are billed outside of what originally was approved. The third, but certainly not last, is dose optimization and auditing. Verifying that the dose that was billed is consistent with the member's weight base or flat dose protocol, and that the frequency also aligns with clinical guidelines. Overbilling on a medical benefit drug is actually a lot more common than most employers realize. And this is one of the areas where clinical review really adds a direct, quantifiable value. I'd like to kind of talk about a real life case study that came directly out of a high cost claimant review done by our team. This member was being treated for an autoimmune disease known as Crohn's with an IV infusion therapy at a hospital outpatient facility. When we looked at the claims data, we identified not only a significant cost variance the plan was paying, they were paying actually well over 5 times the expected cost for that drug, but a clinical concern was noted as well. The unit dose being administered was actually outside the established daily maximum dose guidelines for safe clinical care. So this wasn't just a billing anomaly, it was a clinical finding. And this distinction really matters because now it changes the nature of the conversation entirely from a cost discussion to a patient safety and care appropriate discussion, which ultimately resulted in reimbursements due to these findings. This is exactly what it looks like when clinical and financial analysis work together. You don't just find an overpayment, you're protecting the member.
Thank you all for the wonderful conversation. Now let's shift to GLP-1s, because this is probably the topic we get asked about more than anything else right now, and for good reason. Nelly, would you like us to walk us through about GLP-1s?
Thank you, Anthony. Yes, a few years ago, the question employers were asking was whether to cover GLP-1s at all. That question has largely been resolved for diabetes and cardiovascular conditions, but the conversation has moved on. The question now is how to cover them in a way that's both clinically appropriate and financially sustainable. Here's why that matters. Pharmacy costs now account for 24% of total healthcare spending. And GLP-1s for weight management alone are driving insurance premium increases from 5 to 14%. That's not a rounding error. And here's the complication. Blanket coverage and blanket exclusions both carry real risk. Blanket coverage without guardrails can be financially unsustainable. But broad exclusions may face legal challenges, and they also leave members without access to treatments that in the right clinical context can deliver meaningful health outcomes. So the answer is somewhere in the middle.
And I'll just add a quick clinical anchor here before Nelly continues. For diabetes and cardiovascular indications, the clinical case for coverage is very strong. That standard of care and the evidence base is well established. Now, where it gets a little bit more nuanced and where the financial stakes are at its highest is weight management. That's where structure and guardrails become absolutely essential for both the member and the plan. Now, Nelly will walk us through the coverage framework.
The framework that works for employers is built around one principle: differentiate by indication. On the pharmacy side, coverage for diabetes management, cardiovascular disease, and cardiometabolic conditions should be straightforward. Cover it. This is a standard of care. It's clinically essential, and your employees increasingly expect it. For weight management, the approach is different. This is where structure matters and where the guardrails protect both the member and the plan.
And specifically, what that means is step therapy before GLP-1 access. It means BMI thresholds combined with those comorbid conditions, not just the BMI alone. It means requiring lifestyle management program participation and regular progress reviews. Without these guardrails, the longer-term risks, such as muscle loss, bone density reduction, weight regain, this really can generate new medical costs that offset any short-term pharmacy savings. With them, GLP-1 programs can be both clinically effective and financially defensible.
Ashley's right, and the numbers prove it. Let me show you exactly what the cost difference looks like over time. This chart tracks per member per month GLP-1 costs across 2 paths: plans with no management strategy and plans that put guardrails Ashley described into place. Both trends are increasing, and that's expected. Utilization is increasing, indications are expanding, and more products are entering the market. GLP-1 spend is going to grow. The question is how fast. In 2022, off-label use of Ozempic began to surface. By 23, forward-thinking plans started deploying utilization management strategies, drawing a clear line between weight management and diabetes management. Those early adopters began to see the impact by 2024, holding their trend at $18 per member per month compared to the $25 for unmanaged plans. That gap has continued to widen into 25 and is projected to grow further into 26. And it will not close on its own. As utilization continues to rise and new products come to market, the financial distance between managed and unmanaged plans will keep expanding. For plans without a structured program in place, that trajectory becomes increasingly difficult to sustain.
All right, thanks, Nelly. Before we move on, let's pause and tackle a question that was submitted. Most people understand that GLP-1s are medications someone is on for life. How can we manage those expectations?
The answer is that coverage doesn't have to be an all or nothing. It doesn't have to be forever without accountability. A structured program gives you the framework to cover appropriately, require ongoing clinical engagement, and build in checkpoints that keep both the member and the plan aligned over time. That's very different from an open coverage decision with no off-ramp. The plans that are in best position right now are the ones that set those expectations up front at the point of coverage authorization, not after the member's been on the drug for 2 years. So with that said, I want to leave this pillar with a case study that brings a full strategy together, because this is what it looks like when you execute across all these levers simultaneously. To give a little background, it was a large self-funded employer in the public sector that came to us looking for a solution to their growing pharmacy spend. Their pharmacy benefit was previously embedded with their health plan carrier, limiting cost visibility and negotiating leverage. As specialty and GLP-1s costs accelerated in 2024, pharmacy became their fastest growing expense. Their rebates were well below market benchmarks, no visibility into specialty drug components, a carrier-controlled formulary, and limited cost containment recommendations. So what do? First, we carved out the pharmacy benefit to an independent PBM coalition with 100% rebate pass-through directly to the plan sponsor. Then we layered a targeted formulary management, step therapy, prior authorization optimization, and biosimilar substitution. Lastly, we replaced bundled pricing opacity with monthly line item reporting, ingredient cost, dispensing fees, rebates, all visible, all accountable. So here's what the savings look like. Rebate reimbursement improved by $47 per member per month. Plan cost decreased by a little under $14 per member per month. And monthly line item reporting replaced the bundled pricing that had been masking costs from the start. When we net it all together, this employer saved a total of $61.18 per member per month, which is a 28% reduction in pharmacy spend. This is just one example of meaningful savings. The strategies that drove it are available to many self-funded employers in a similar position. This is what's possible when pharmacy is managed with the right structure, the right contracts, and the right team behind it.
Okay, thank you again, Nelly. So now let's turn to the segment of the population with the largest driver of cost and the emerging risk that may contribute even more to spend in this category, gene therapy.
Right now, in most employer health plans, a small fraction of members drives a disproportionate share of the costs. And here's what matters. Many of those members are identifiable in advance. The savings here matter because they're tangible, and any mitigation translates dollars back to the plan versus a theoretical ROI. This is where analytics can help us monitor populations within the plan. That membership who carries the higher disease burdens and predictive indicators overlaid on these populations can help us identify those most at risk for disease progression or treatment shifts, giving us the opportunity to intervene earlier, coordinate care, and redirect spend where possible. It's in that lens that I'd like to talk about one of the greatest challenges as well as opportunities for employers, the variability of the cost of care depending on where it's delivered. Certain sites of care being standardly more expensive, such as hospital-based outpatient for imaging, infusion, and more, that depending on the nature of the claimant may be able to be treated in another lower cost site of care, such as an office setting, standalone imaging, ambulatory surgical center, or even at home. These changes can drive meaningful impacts even on high-cost claimants, especially when the treatment is recurring by nature. The challenge here is identifying the opportunity from the data and balancing it with the right clinical framing to ask the questions to maximize the potential for savings around this variable piece of the puzzle.
That variability is exactly what we're watching for on the clinical side. So when we pull up a high-cost claimant, site of care is actually one of the very first questions that we're asking, because the right drug in the wrong setting is quite a problem. What we're seeing often is that the clinical authorization happened. The drug may be appropriate, but nobody's asked where it should be administered. And by the time it hits the data, the decision has already been made. That's why we really try to get eyes on these cases as soon as possible, so we can ask those site of care questions before the pattern is set and not after 3 infusion cycles at a hospital outpatient rate. That leads us right into how we think about clinical oversight of those high-cost claimants a bit more broadly. Kind of speaking a little further into clinical oversight of high-cost claimants, this really isn't just about cost containment. It's about care appropriateness. When we're looking at a population through the clinical lens, we're asking, is this member receiving care that is evidence-based? Is it delivered in the right setting? And does it align with what the data tells us about their condition trajectory? Many times the answer reveals quite a few gaps, not just because the providers are acting in bad faith, but because no one is connecting the dots across the claims and between the pharmacy, the labs, and the diagnosis itself. That's what clinical informatics really enables us to do. It gives us that complete picture so we can identify those members who need a more active coordination, flag the clinical risk before it becomes catastrophic, and bring the right interventions to the right people at the right time.
The power of data can greatly inform meaningful plan enhancements to manage cost. But what happens when the risk is not something that is shown up yet in the claims? Gene therapy represents one such area employers that is rapidly rising, where details of eligibility and qualification lurk in data sources most plan sponsors cannot access readily. It's here that we find the right type of analysis will drive the approach, because without it, what it means in practical terms is that a single unplanned gene therapy claim can reshape your entire plan year. It will erode your stop-loss leverage and create exposure your current contracts weren't designed to absorb. And here's the thing about gene therapy risk. It isn't entirely random. It's identifiable, which means it's manageable if you do the work before the claim arrives.
Moving further into gene therapy pipelines, what this pipeline data really tells us is that gene therapy has moved well beyond rare diseases, and that this critical shift for employers is starting to internalize. Oncology, neurology, hematology, metabolic conditions. These are all conditions that exist in most employer populations. This isn't just a niche exposure anymore. So the real question for employers needs to shift from, will this ever affect us, to what does our actual exposure look like? And do we have the right clinical and financial structures in place when a claim comes through? The pipeline tells us it's coming. The employers who are best positioned are the ones having those conversations now, not after a multi-million-dollar claim arrives. When I bring up gene therapy with employers, the response I often get is something like, yeah, it's on our radar, but it probably won't show up in our population. I really want to push back on that today. This market is accelerating faster than most employers realize. There are already over 40 FDA-approved gene therapies, with more than 140 expected by the year 2030. Treatments for type 1 diabetes, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's are already in the active pipeline for the next 3 to 5 years. The market is projected to reach well over $9 billion by 2034, with individual treatment costs ranging anywhere from over $900,000 on the low end to over $4 million on the higher end. So when we say a single claim can reshape a plan year, that's not just hypothetical. That's an environment we're already operating in today.
Ashley, we've talked about the pipeline accelerating and the cost exposure being real. But for most employers in this room, gene therapy still feels abstract. From a clinical standpoint, how does an employer actually begin to know if they have members who could be candidates for one of these therapies in the next few years? And what are you looking for in the data in terms of how do you find the details that aren't readily visible?
Sure, and thanks for that question, Anthony. Now, I want to be very clinically honest here. Identifying gene therapy risk in the data is not straightforward. We can look for signals such as certain testing activity, diagnostic patterns in the claims that may suggest a member might be on the pathway toward a qualifying condition. But those are triggers for a closer conversation. They are really not a guarantee. There's real limitations in what the claims data can tell us, and we don't overstate that. What we can do is use those signals to ask the right questions and make sure that the coverage structures and the stop loss arrangements are positioned for those exposures that may be coming, even when the data can't tell us exactly when or who.
And building on that, what does preparation look like? The truth is, knowing the pipeline, taking an additional lens and looking at the claims analysis, specifically genetic condition markers, testing signals, as Ashley mentioned, in your existing data, that may indicate members that could qualify for a gene therapy in the future. From there, it's generating population-specific risk assessments and therapy eligibility reviews. That gives employers a picture of their potential exposure to allow for planning with the expertise of financial and clinical teams on how best to navigate that potential risk.
And here's the thing. Once you know your exposure, you can act on it. And the way we find that exposure is by looking backward before it hits forward. We're not predicting who's going to need gene therapy, but we can definitely look at what's already in the data. As I had mentioned before, those testing patterns, diagnosis codes, condition trajectories, these are all signals that a member may be already on the path towards eligibility. And by the time a gene therapy authorization request comes in, we want to have already seen that the member is in our clinical review process. That preparation is what allows the financial and the clinical response to move in parallel with those stop loss negotiations, prior authorizations criterias, and centers of excellence routing, instead of reacting after the claim is already in motion.
All right. Thank you all so much for some great conversation. Now, let me take a moment to try to bring this back together. Because the three pillars we've just covered are each powerful on their own. But what the data consistently shows is that they're exponentially more powerful when they work together. Here's a brief overview of everything we've covered today and the core finding of our 2026 cost management report. No single strategy solves this problem alone. Not specialty drug controls, not GLP-1 guardrails, and not gene therapy risk management. However, what the data shows consistently is that these strategies multiply each other. Better data leads to more targeted action. More targeted action produces smarter contracts and stronger coverage structures. And those structures generate cleaner data for the next decision. It's a compounding effect, essentially a loop. And the employers who built it are seeing results that isolated strategies simply can't match. Let me show you what that looks like in practice. What you're looking at in this model in action. It starts with a baseline assessment. The claims analysis and contract reviews establish what you're actually dealing with. Clinical informatics and predictive analytics convert that foundation into a targeted action. Those insights then drive the strategies we've seen the last 40 minutes discussing: biosimilar adoption, dose optimization, site of care redirection, GLP-1 program design, and gene therapy risk identification. Those same analytics reveal the right financing structure to support all of it. Could be from reference-based pricing to SIRAs to stop-loss optimizations, or possibly gene therapy carve-outs. Each layer doesn't just add value, it actually amplifies the layers around it. That's Hub's integrated model: clinical, pharmacy, financial, and compliance expertise working in concert under one coordinated strategy. And it's why the employers who take this approach consistently outperform those who address these challenges one at a time. So now let's talk about where we go from here. Where do you start? That's the question I get most often, and the answer is different for every organization. The right starting point is wherever the pressure is greatest in your plan right now. If gene therapy exposure is keeping you up at night, start there. Do a risk assessment and a stop-loss review. If specialty drug spend feels out of control, do a PBM contract review and establish a biosimilar strategy. If a small group of members is driving a significant portion of your cost, use predictive analytics and targeted care coordination. That's your first move. The important thing is to start somewhere. Every starting point builds towards the next. And one of the most consistent first moves we see deliver immediate impact, regardless of employer size or plan complexity, is the PBM contract review. Most employers don't have full visibility into their pharmacy program or how it's actually performing. That's not an accident. PBM contracts are extraordinarily complex, and that complexity has a lack of transparency, and it obscures a lot of the information that is so critical to managing your plan. So when Hub does a contract review, we typically uncover three key things: hidden margins and spread pricing the employer had no idea was happening, rebate terms that haven't kept pace with the market, and formulary gaps that are quietly driving up cost. So at Hub, we built a tool specifically for this and to address these items. That tool is called Diagnostic RX. It's Hub's proprietary benchmarking solution that compares your current PBM contract terms against Hub negotiated arrangements across the market. It identifies where you're leaving value on the table and pinpoints the gaps most likely to be driving unnecessary costs in your pharmacy program. The goal isn't a one-time fix. It's building a pharmacy program that's structured to perform and keep performing as the market evolves. Your Hub advisor can walk you through what that looks like for your specific plan. Now, here's a framework you can take back to your teams tomorrow. In your first month, build your baseline. Request a comprehensive claims analysis, review your PBM and stop-loss contract terms, and assess your gene therapy exposure. In months 2 and 3, build your strategy. Prioritize interventions based on what the data shows. Model return on investment for your top options, and engage clinical support for your highest cost members. From months 4 through 12, execute, communicate, and measure. Launch your prioritized solutions, keep your members informed, and track outcomes against the metrics you set at the start. 3 principles apply regardless of where you begin. Quantify before you act, get ahead of the risk, ideally 12 to 18 months in advance, and bring clinical, pharmacy, and clinically informed analytics expertise to the table at the same time. The employers who do that, who stop treating these as separate problems and start building an integrated system, are the ones who break the cost cycle for good. So now, before we wrap up, let's take a few minutes to address some of the questions that came in ahead of today's call. Ashley, I'd like to start with you. So the question we received is, the pipeline of accelerating and cost exposure being real for specialty drugs, but for most employers in this room, gene therapy still feels abstract. From a clinical standpoint, how does an employer begin to know if they have members who could be candidates for one of these gene therapies in the next few years? And then also, what are you looking for in the data? How do you find details that aren't readily visible?
Thank you for the question, Anthony. So as I had mentioned before, looking for certain claims patterns that exist within the data is really the place to start. As I had mentioned before, diagnosis codes, certain claims pattern that indicate certain testing, things to start there. And the claims data is retrospective, so we can't get really ahead of it and be proactive, but what we can do is really apply the right clinical lens to what is already existing. Those specialty drug claims, also to add to that, those are all flags that really broaden a conversation that needs to happen. And then from there, it's about asking the right questions around the contract structures, the prior auth, the stop loss positioning, your carrier alignment. The data surfaces the flag, and then the clinical lens really determines on what steps to take next.
Perfect. We've got a part 2 to that question that also came in from another listener. For Ashley again, what size employer does gene therapy risk management apply to?
Really, there is no one size fits all. Everybody has a risk candidate within their population. And it doesn't matter on the funding arrangement either, whether you're fully insured all the way to self-funded with your more custom specialty contracts. Every employer has a potential candidate risk that exists within their population. Again, it's identifying those claims patterns to see who may be higher risk than others, and then applying the next steps for a broader conversation.
Great. Another question that we had come in, I think this was one for Raquel. Raquel, as it relates to the data, and where does it support the review? What are limitations in data? And how do we get the right story to the employers for them to act upon?
That's a great question, Anthony. We hear it a lot because there's so much nuance to the data that comes in around health plans. In this particular instance, it can help with identifying those patterns, those trends that Ashley has spoken of, especially a lot of the detail. But what a lot of people don't realize is that most of the data that informs the analysis is coming from process systems. So there might be gaps in the financial lens here, which is where a robust analysis with your financial team to look for that gap and get the true cost is really important. The other part of the limitation is that I'm only looking at point in time data. It's already occurred, but so much of it is informed by what surrounds your plan. What's the culture of your company? What are your leave policies? How do you encourage people to navigate the health plan before them? And what are those resources? A lot of that sort of storytelling really helps us get to the point of the right type of slicing and data means to really get to what is truly actionable for that employer.
What about for those employers that maybe have less than 100 employees on the health plan and they have lost visibility or doesn't have great reporting data with their health plan? What can they do from a strategies perspective to do cost containment?
Oh, that's perfect. I love this question because what a lot of employers at that size don't realize is that they actually have more access to data than they know. So if they look at internal reporting from their HR teams, such as around, leave of absence, disability reporting, on top of running information like a census-based analysis to identify where their population that's enrolled in the plan and the prevalence of social determinant of health risk and other patterns within the geography that they service really can help them inform, do I need a population health strategy deployed here? Do I need to maybe look at an access issue because according to the reporting for the area where I have the most density, it's more rural and I need to supply something like virtual care. So these are different ways that you can leverage that data, and noticing that your leave of absence or your disability is driven by maternity claims can allow you to reach out around strategies for that as well. So there is really a wealth of information beyond just the core health plan reporting that employers can tap into and find those right levers.
Great. Let's take another question. We've got some time. I'm going to turn this one over to Nelly. We've talked a lot about PBM and PBM contracts. Let's talk to the employers and the listeners on the phone. How do you know if your contract is underperforming? How do you know if it's overperforming? How do you know if there's something that you need to specifically look at in the contract as it relates to your next cycle of PBM negotiations or market checks, or even your RFP process?
Thank you, Anthony. That's a great question. I mean, the honest answer is that most employers don't, and that's by design. PBM contracts are complex, and the terms that matter most, such as spread pricing, rebate guarantees, formulary exclusions, those are often buried in language that makes comparison very difficult. The starting point is a benchmarking review that compares your current terms against market best practices. Ask yourself, when was the last time you benchmarked your plan and your contract against industry best practices? Well, Hub has a diagnostic RX tool, as Anthony mentioned earlier, that does exactly that. We've been able to gather all of our proprietary intellectual information in creating this tool that will give our employers insight on how their PBM contract compares to best-in-class terms, conditions, pricing, and discounts. Our tool identifies the gaps and quantifies what you're missing and how you can either renegotiate, creating a framework of whether or not it's time to go to market, renew your current contract, or simply have a market check.
How often should a RX diagnostic or diagnostic RS be run with a client?
I would say you could conservatively run that on an annual basis. The market is quickly evolving, and it's great to see where shifts may align from year to year. On average, pharmacy contracts are about 2 to 3 years in terms. So having an annual refreshed benchmarking analysis allows you to have that assurance of whether or not it's time to plan ahead for the next market event.
Okay. And so once the contract is in really good shape, we've gone through Hub's diagnostic RX tool, we've done the market checks or the RFP, and we have a solid performing contract. How do we deal with some of the other cost areas like GLP-1s? Are there any creative payment options that employers can leverage to avoid cutting GLP-1s completely, but still offer a great benefit for their employees?
That was a great question from our audience. And I can tell you that that is something that we have been, Hub Pharmacy team has been working with several different vendor partners to create those alternative solutions that allow for optionality for employers, whether employers are covering GLP-1s for weight management and can't sustain the cost, or they currently do not cover it, but wanting to have a transitional approach where they have some leverage in how, to prevent any kind of unsustainable trend management. Some of those options include access to direct-to-consumer pricing, whether it's through employer-funded HRA opportunities, whether it's access to employee cash paying options, having the opportunity to get the lower cost direct-to-consumer GLP-1s at their own expense. Other options include building in disease management strategies where there is clinical oversight and engagement with lifestyle coaches, clinicians, and case managers that will ensure that there's ongoing oversight, engagement, and healthy lifestyle that is associated with access to these medications. So the time is great now as more options are coming into the marketplace to ensure that there's accessibility, at the same time being financially reasonable as far as how our employers can sustain having opportunities for our employees to have some sort of a coverage, whether it's within the plan or outside of the plan.
Great. Well, Nelly, Ashley, Raquel, I want to thank you so much for an outstanding conversation. We have covered a lot of ground today. We talked about specialty drug transparency, site of care optimization, to GLP-1 management, and then wrapped up with gene therapy risk. For those that are out listening on to today's webinar, I hope you're leaving with both a clearer picture of the landscape and a practical sense of where to focus next. I want to thank each of you in attendance for spending part of your day with us on these important topics. If today's conversation sparked questions about where your organization stands, our team is here to help. Reach out to your Hub representative or visit hubinternational.com for more information. We're also going to make sure you leave here with everything you need. Following today's session, you'll receive a link to the replay page. There you'll find the recording, a downloadable PDF of the presentation, a glossary of key terms and acronyms, and a link to Hub's 2026 Cost Management Report. From there, you can go deeper on anything we covered today or share it with a colleague who couldn't join. You'll also find information on your continuing education credits in that same follow-up email. However, before we leave you, we want to give you a quick note about some upcoming webinars that may be of interest to you and your teams. On July 15th, what the One Big Beautiful Bill Act means for your benefit strategy in 2027. This much anticipated sequel will cover what's changed since the bill's passage in July of 2025 and what employers need to know and do heading into this next renewal cycle. Following that, we have the next two installments in our cost management webinar series. On July 22nd, that webinar will be From Projections to Planning, making the most of Hub's Benefits Cost Trends Report. In this session, our actuarial and financial team will bring to life its 2026 and 2027 Benefits Cost Trends Report and explain what the latest trends and projections mean for your benefits planning heading into open enrollment, including how to present cost projections to leadership. And then finally, on July 29th, we'll have the third installment, Beyond Fully Insured, Alternative Benefits Funding Strategies for Small and Mid-sized Employers. This session will explore the funding alternatives that give smaller organizations the same cost control tools larger employers rely on, from level funding and medical stop-loss captives to reference-based pricing and PEOs. If rising premiums have you wondering where there's a better way to structure your plan, this session is going to be really important to you. If you'd like to register for any of these sessions, simply scan the QR code on your screen now. We'll also include more detail on these webinars in your follow-up email. And finally, before you sign off, please take a moment to complete the brief survey that will appear on your screen. Let us know whether today's topic was valuable, what you'd like to hear more about in future sessions, and whether you'd like a Hub advisor to follow up with you directly. Your feedback is very important to us, and it helps us continue delivering the content and conversations you've come to expect from Hub. On behalf of Hub International, thank you for joining today's webinar. This now concludes our broadcast.